good. Okay, when we last spoke, which seems so long ago, we left off talking about, let's do normal view here. Here we go. We left off talking about the types of hormones that the hypothalamus makes. And I said that they're either releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones. And if they're releasing hormones, I want you to think of releasing hormones being as permissive, meaning they're going to tell the anterior pituitary, it's okay for you to release your hormones now. If the hypothalamus releases an inhibitory hormone, that tells the anterior pituitary, absolutely no, it is not a good time for you to release your hormone right now. So for example, if the hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone, it will go to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary in turn will release growth hormone. If the hypothalamus releases growth hormone inhibitory hormone, also known as somatostatin, the anterior pituitary does nothing. It will not release growth hormone. Please notice that not all of the releasing hormones that we see from the hypothalamus have a, how do I want to say it? There are two sides to every coin, right? There's a head and a tail. So most students want to say for every releasing hormone, there's an inhibitory hormone, and there isn't. There is not. For any of these hormones that are, quote, unpaired, meaning there isn't an inhibitory to go along with it, then what happens is, so all of these here do not have an inhibitory hormone to go with them. So what does the pituitary do if there's no inhibitory hormone that complements the releasing hormone? And the answer is, if the hypothalamus, for example, if the hypothalamus does not release gonadotropin releasing hormone, then the anterior pituitary did not get the okay signal. And the default would be, no, you don't release your hormone until I say it is okay. Only a couple of them have a releasing hormone and an inhibitory hormone, and that's growth hormone and the prolactin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, I should say. Those are the only two that have a reverse hormone, an inhibitory. All the others, like I said, the default is if the hypothalamus doesn't release them, that silence, if you will, tells the anterior pituitary, no go, not allowed to release. If the hypothalamus does release gonadotropin releasing hormone, then the pituitary would release luteinizing hormone and FSH. I'll talk about those in a moment. If the hypothalamus releases thyrotropin releasing hormone, then the anterior pituitary would release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And again, I'm going to talk about this in the next couple slides. If the hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone, sometimes called factor, so you might read CRF for corticotropin releasing factor, then the anterior pituitary would release ACTH. So for those hormones from the hypothalamus, there is no inhibitory hormone. There's no complementary inhibitory hormone. And the default for the anterior pituitary would be to not release its hormone. Not until it's told, yes, you can, until there's a releasing hormone, okay? Until there's a releasing hormone saying that the anterior pituitary can release its hormone, then the anterior pituitary will. So releasing hormones, think of them as go dog go, and lack of them would be stop dog stop. And then if it's an inhibitory hormone that's released, think of it as the hypothalamus saying, absolutely not. And I am telling you officially, absolutely no, do not release anything. So on this slide, you're seeing the hypothalamic pituitary interaction. On the right side over here, on this side that I'm highlighting in purple, we see the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary technically is an extension of the hypothalamus. It is not its own gland, but early anatomists thought it was. The posterior pituitary, if you look carefully here, the neuronal cell bodies are in the hypothalamus. Their axons descend into the posterior pituitary where the terminal boutons are. Again, the posterior pituitary is really just an extension of the hypothalamus, much like how my arm is an extension off of my torso. So the posterior pituitary does not make any hormones. Rather, they are hormones that are stored in the terminal boutons of these hypothalamic neurons. The two hormones that are released from these hypothalamic neurons are ADH and oxytocin. And we talked a lot about oxytocin last week. ADH is going to tell the kidneys to retain water. And when you study your kidney lecture, you'll hear more about ADH. If you retain more water, then your blood volume goes up, and so would your blood pressure. For oxytocin, as we discussed last week, it leads to uterine contractions and also mammary gland contractions. It is the hormone that would lead to those labor pains that we talked about, and also the contraction of the mammary glands to lead to release of milk. It's not the hormone that tells the mammary glands to make milk, that's prolactin. So here we are, uterine and smooth muscle contraction, even smooth muscle and mammary glands. And for the males, we talked about oxytocin, of course, being important for both males and females for our orgasm and ejaculation. Again, and we also talked about how in females, there seems to be this dose dependent, right? There's pleasure on one side and then intense pain on the other. Then the anterior pituitary is something that we need to address. And the anterior pituitary I'm highlighting here in yellow. Now the anterior pituitary actually originated back when you were an embryo and you looked like you were a fish with gill slits. The anterior pituitary originated in your throat. And that gland rose superiorly until it got to your sphenoid bone. Remember the butterfly-shaped looking one? And it took up residence in that sella turcica. Remember the Turkish seat? And part of the hypothalamus grew down and also took up residence in the Turkish seat, the sella turcica. That's the posterior pituitary that I just talked about. So the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary truly have different embryonic origins. The anterior pituitary is a standalone gland. It makes and stores and releases 7 hormones. And those 7 hormones are shown here in the yellow boxes. And to help me remember them, I remember melons grow and produce through late fall. Melons grow and produce through late fall. And that M for melon stands for MSH, which is melanocyte stimulating hormone. And here it is, it tells you what it does. It's mostly active during embryology. Very little significance for that hormone in adults. G stands for growth hormone. The word and stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Produce stands for prolactin. Through stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Late stands for luteinizing hormone. And fall stands for follicular stimulating hormone. Excuse me. So melanocyte stimulating hormone is obviously going to stimulate melanocytes to produce a pigment. Again, mostly active during embryology. Growth hormone obviously is going to cause the body to grow, not just lengthwise. It doesn't just target bone. It also targets cartilage, which is important for those epiphyseal plates. So we do get bone lengthening because of it, but growing requires a lot of resources, a lot of energy. Growth hormone is also important to stimulate muscles to take in more amino acids, so the muscles can also grow as the skeleton grows. So growth hormone is much, much more beyond bone. Growth hormone can target adipose tissue, other target cells, and I'll talk about that towards the end of this lecture. ACTH is going to target the adrenal cortex, and in response, the adrenal cortex will release cortisol. There are other hormones that are released by the adrenal cortex, but those other hormones are provoked to be released in a different way, a humoral way, which we talked about last week, which means something in the blood. Only cortisol obeys the H, hypothalamic, P, pituitary, A, adrenal gland pathway. And I will discuss this pathway in just a moment. Prolactin is going to stimulate the mammary glands to produce milk. TSH is going to, its name tells you what it does, thyroid stimulating hormone. It's going to stimulate the thyroid gland. What will the thyroid gland do as a result? Release thyroid hormones. Then gonadotropin releasing hormone, like I said earlier, is going to cause the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. And notice for both of these down here, they target both sets of gonads, meaning both are required for males and females. Both will target the ovaries in females and the testes in males. More on this, not just in this PowerPoint, but more specifically in your reproductive chapter and PowerPoint lecture. So we talked last week that hormones are released into the bloodstream. And I want you to see up here, we have the hypothalamus, and here is a capillary bed. And it's followed by a second set of capillary beds, right? We see 2 capillary beds in tandem, a superior one and an inferior one. Well, from last lab unit, you learned that whenever you have 2 capillary beds in tandem, it's called a portal system. So this one is called the hypothalamic. So here's the hypothalamic capillary. Oops. And that's the superior one, as I was telling you. And then here is the second capillary, secondary plexus of this portal system. So it's the second one in, that's not the one I wanted to. So the superior one is the primary capillary, and then there's a second one. So this is the hypothalamic hypophyseal. Another word for hypophysis is pituitary. And yes, there's a capillary bed around the posterior pituitary, and there's also a capillary bed around the anterior. Those are both the secondary one, if you want to think of it that way. They're both inferior to the hypothalamic capillary bed, which is superior to them. So these releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones that the hypothalamus can release are going to be released into the hypophyseal, sorry, too many H's, the hypothalamic capillary up here, the first one. Then those hormones are going to travel a short distance into the anterior pituitary. And then those hormones are going to target the cells in the anterior pituitary, and then they in turn will release their hormones, either prolactin or growth hormone, or any of the 7 that I told you about on the previous slide. So now, again, the pituitary gland is called the hypophysis. I just said that on the previous slide. It sits in the hypophyseal fossa of the sella turcica. We learned that back in lab unit 1. And there's an anterior called the adenohypophysis and a posterior called the neurohypophysis. The neurohypophysis is called that because it truly is an extension of the hypothalamic neurons. Remember, their axons go through this little connecting stalk called the infundibulum, and then the terminal boutons are found in the posterior pituitary. And the hormones that are released from there are ADH and oxytocin. The anterior pituitary is a standalone gland. It does not have any true connections to the hypothalamus, not really. It was a gland that grew up superiorly. So it's not an extension of the hypothalamus, it's just in close proximity, right? So the hypothalamus didn't grow it, the anterior pituitary came up, and then there were these connections that were made through the capillary beds, etc. So again, it originates from the hypophyseal pouch, which is actually back down here in your throat, which is very weird to think of. And the anterior pituitary, like I said, is going to release melanocyte stimulating hormone, growth hormone, ACTH, prolactin, TSH, luteinizing hormone, and follicular stimulating hormone. 7 hormones total. I can't emphasize it enough. The neurohypophysis does not make hormones. It merely is a place to store the telodendria. Think of that as the terminal boutons. Remember, there are 7 names for, 2 names for everything except for when there's 7, it seems like, in this class. And we can see these neuronal cell bodies up here in the hypothalamus, and then their axons come down here. Again, those axons, the terminal boutons, are releasing antidiuretic hormone. It's also known as vasopressin. It's going to tell the kidneys to reabsorb more water. So it leads to increased water reabsorption, meaning you don't pee as much. It will lead to an increase in blood volume and blood pressure. It also leads to an increase in blood pressure because a secondary action that this hormone has is to cause vasoconstriction, and that means more pressure on the blood inside the vessels. Oxytocin is going to cause smooth muscle contraction, uterine contraction, or in men, it would be the vas deferens for ejaculation. The vas deferens is also called the ductus deferens. And then in smooth muscle in the mammary glands, in the breasts of a woman, it would lead to expression, meaning to express, to allow the milk to come out of the mammary glands. So the mammary glands contract with the smooth muscle and push the milk out. Here are those 7 hormones that the anterior pituitary makes, stores, and releases when told by the hypothalamus that it is okay. So these 7 hormones follow the H, P, and then what we like to call X axis, where the X stands for some third downstream gland. Let me back up a little bit. Let me modify what I just said. Many of these hormones follow the HPX axis, meaning hypothalamic pituitary, and then a third gland. Other hormones of these 7 are just hypothalamus telling the pituitary, and the pituitary, its hormone goes straight to a target cell that's not another gland. Hormones target cells that aren't a gland, another gland. So the ones that are kind of hypothalamic pituitary alone, no third endocrine gland, would be melanocyte stimulating hormone, and prolactin. So prolactin and melanocyte stimulating hormone, they're going to go to an actual target cell that is not going to behave like a gland, like another endocrine gland. And if you're looking at prolactin saying, well, it's targeting, according to this, the testes, you should be careful. The testes can be both an endocrine and exocrine gland. So it depends on what physiology they're being told to perform. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the reproductive chapter. The others here that I will circle in purple do act on another endocrine gland, meaning that next target gland is going to release its own hormone. And you might be saying, well, Kara, growth hormone is just going to skeletal muscle, bone, and adipose tissue. Those aren't endocrine glands. Yeah, but what that little blurb right there is not telling you is that it also targets the liver. And there is actually such a thing as the HPL pathway, and I'll talk about that as well. So it's relatively new. Some textbooks don't address it. I usually see it more in physiology books, not so much as in anatomy books. So give me some time and I will get through all of these. In the meantime, in your textbook, there is a very handy chart, especially to help you with your homework packet, where it tells you the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary. The hormones, it says stored, notice it says stored in the posterior pituitary. What a wonderful thing your textbook has done. So it's really the hypothalamus that releases them, but the terminal boutons have grown away from the actual hypothalamus part that's in the brain part, and now are in this other bulb structure called the posterior pituitary. So it tells you the source. All of these are in the anterior pituitary. There are different cell types in the anterior pituitary that are responsible for making these 7 hormones. For example, it says corticotropic cells. Corticotropic cells. Another way of describing that would be corticotropes. For FSH and LH, it would be gonadotropes. So a trope is basically a cluster of cells that are going to make a particular hormone. Then we have down here somatotropes. You get the idea. Thyrotropes. All of these, and mammotropic cells, mammotropes, right? They're all tropes, a cluster of cells whose job it is to make these particular hormones. And then this chart tells you what it's going to target. What is the target cell or gland? So I told you most of these hormones are going to follow an HP and then some third endocrine gland axis. That means chain of command. So for ACTH, it's going to target the adrenal cortex, a particular layer of the adrenal cortex that I'll talk about called the zona fasciculata. And FSH and LH, they're going to target the ovaries. We'll talk more about that in our reproductive chapter. Thyroid stimulating hormone obviously is going to target the thyroid gland. Prolactin, prolactin is not going to cause the testes in the males to release anything. That's why I said it's not targeting the endocrine part of the testes. Instead, it's just going to help the testes be more sensitive and mindful to luteinizing hormone. Oftentimes we call that a permissive hormone. Permissive means a hormone needs to be around so that another hormone could actually do its job. Melanocyte stimulating hormone is going to target not a third downstream endocrine gland, it's going to target melanocytes. So on my previous slide in yellow, I said these hormones don't obey an HPX axis. After the pituitary gland, they go straight to target cells, and they're going to have biological effects. The other hormones are going to target a third endocrine organ, or gland, I should say, which will in turn release another third downstream hormone. So let's talk about growth hormone. Now, growth hormone, like I said, in a lot of anatomy books, they say it is not part of an HPX pathway. And for the most part, that's true because growth hormone is going to target skeletal muscle and tell skeletal muscle cells to take up more amino acids so they can get bigger and bulkier and grow as the skeleton grows. Growth hormone is going to target bone as well. That we learned about that back in chapter 6. So it's going to it's mitogenic. You should write that down. It's mitogenic. It's going to target cartilage, specifically in the epiphyseal plates. And we get bone lengthening. You heard me say that growing requires energy, requires resources. So growth hormone is also going to target adipocytes, and this is going to lead to more mobilization of fat and using it for energy. Again, growing requires energy. When children grow, in particular, when adolescents grow, they tend to pack on a lot of weight before they actually stretch. So they get wider, they get chunky before they grow. And I'm telling you this because it is a time of angst. These adolescents are consumed by their body image. Many of them are. And it just can be very upsetting. For example, some of my ladies out there in the audience, you might have gone through your growth spurt early. Maybe you were still in middle school, and you got real tall and you started to develop breasts as well. You probably got some unwanted attention, and you were probably very conscientious about that. So that was not necessarily a happy time for you. You might not have wanted that extra attention. Well, what about for boys? If they don't grow as early as some of their friends, then they're the short shrimp, right? And that gives them a lot of unwanted attention too, but in a different way. So it's a very awkward time for growing, because growth is not universal for everyone. There is a timing and a tempo. So there's an onset, and then how quickly you go through your growing period. That's what I mean by tempo. Timing, when does it begin? And how quickly do you go through these changes? Some people go through them very, very quickly. There is such a thing as growth pains, for example, where children are growing so quickly. By the way, teenagers have the same growth rate as toddlers. It's amazing. So, for example, some of you might have purchased, mom or dad bought you a pair of jeans or a pair of shoes, and then a month later, too small. And they probably said, what are you doing? Well, you were growing. That's nothing you can control. So it's a time where there's rapid growth for a lot of kids. And then for some, it's more of a progressive growth, slow and steady. And again, it can create a lot of angst and body image issues for these teenagers. I can tell you this: when a child is about to grow and they get a little chunky, they're packing it on because growing requires resources. They get the adipocytes start filling up with fat. When the growth actually happens, all of those fat stores get utilized. They really do. That's what I mean by increased fat utilization. There's mobilization of the fat stores. That's not a time to start getting on a teenager about, you don't say things like, oh, you're getting a little chunky. Maybe you should go work out more. All you do is sleep. Well, growing also, growth hormone is released during sleeping hours. That's when it's released. So I'm going to tell you a story about my oldest son, and maybe you'll appreciate the angst he had, and maybe you identify to it. I'll start with me. I was not a girl that entered puberty early. I was completely the opposite. I was the shortest in my class, second to Lori Gentilini. I know this because we frequently had a line up from smallest to tallest for all sorts of things like sports and ceremonies and things like that. So I was one of the shortest, smallest, petite girls in my class. And I was like that even through most of my high school years. I remember, I believe it was the summer of my junior year. I had just finished my junior year, so summer year going into senior year. I came in from the backyard. I was outside getting some sun. I came in to get another soda. My mom was walking by with laundry. My mom's a nurse. So she had all this folded laundry. I'm walking into the kitchen. My mother has this weird way of parenting. Whenever she wants our attention, she just kind of sneak attacks us to get our attention because she wants to have some sort of talk, and then it's over. So here I'm walking in from the backyard. She's walking by with folded clothes. Next thing I know, she just drops them, picks me up, pushes me up against the cabinet. I'm thinking I'm in trouble for some reason. And this is what she said to me. If you don't start your period this year, I'm taking you to the doctor to get shots to get it started. Then she let go of me, picked up the clothes, and walked down the hall to put them away. That's how my mother, the nurse, had a conversation with me about menstrual cycles. That was my big girl talk. I don't know what yours sounded like, but that was mine. I didn't grow until about that summer. Later that summer, I started going through my growth spurt. I started to develop boobs. So up until that point, I was a boobless wonder. Oh, you can imagine how much young boys, or I should say young, soon to be adult men, high school boys, really thought of me as something they should pursue. I was like the worst thing ever. I was involved in sports, all sorts of sports. Why? Because I grew up with boys, and if I wanted to play outside, I had to learn how to play tackle football on asphalt. So I was a little bit of a tomboy, a small tomboy. So tomboy, loved sports. Straight A student, nerd, definitely nerd, and boobless wonder. What young man is going to be interested in that? Zero. I did not have my first kiss until I was almost a sophomore in college. So that was my angst. I didn't grow. I wasn't getting any attention, not like all the other females in my class. So I had that opposite angst. I finally did grow when I actually did go to my senior year orientation day. I remember my teachers going, "Kara, you've grown." And my mother was very happy because early that fall, I actually started my menstrual cycle. That's a funny thing also. Usually young girls don't get their menstrual cycle until they're big enough, meaning body mass, to sustain a pregnancy. And we are the second most obese nation in the world. Our young girls are getting heavier earlier in life, and that's why they're starting to go into reproductive maturity earlier. We hear nightmare stories of 10-year-olds getting pregnant. So I was kind of the opposite, an almost textbook example of if you're too petite and small, you don't start that menstrual cycle. You don't develop. You're not big enough to sustain a pregnancy. That's one theory of why we are seeing an earlier onset of puberty and menstrual cycles in young girls in this nation. One theory. So I was a late bloomer. That's the take-home message from that. I was a late bloomer. And my children followed me. My husband was an early bloomer, went through his growth spurt, was the big man on campus. I don't know how the nerd, geeky athlete girl landed the big man on campus. I don't know. That's a different story. But my two boys followed my growth patterns. And that's pretty typical. Children will follow the parents' growth patterns. Usually it's a blend of the two, but both my children followed me, very much late bloomers. So for my poor oldest son in particular, this was great angst for him. He is still very athletic. He was small, like his mama, and fast. He was like Speedy Gonzales from the cartoons, right? From Bugs Bunny Roadrunner cartoons. He was super fast. You could put him anywhere on the soccer field and he would perform. He quickly on his club team became captain of the club team because he was so good and very likable. All the kids liked him, the coach liked him, and the kids respected him. The coach respected him for being able to talk to the adults and also talk to the kids. And then the other kids started growing, and Hayden didn't. And he went from being captain of the soccer team and starting every game and playing every game to not starting every game and not playing every game. And certainly that was a huge hit because he was used to playing all of the game, if not most of it. So his status started to slide. And the reason why it did is because, and the coach outright told him, H, you need to grow, bud. When you grow, I'll put you back out there. He wasn't the fastest anymore. All those other boys went through the change and had more muscle mass. Thank you, growth hormone. They could out-muscle him off the ball. They were faster than him. He was just this little tiny shrimp for the longest time and benched and then lost the captain's seat. It was so hard for that little guy at the time. Couldn't understand. He had to go to the doctor for a physical. He came back practically in tears because his dad took him. Dad didn't ask the right questions. And one of the questions Hayden asked the doctor was, when am I going to grow? And how tall will I be? And the doctor told him this. See, I wasn't there. Dad was. The doctor said, well, you're 16 now. You should have grown by now. So you're probably not going to get much taller than you are, maybe an inch or two. And Hayden was like 5'6" at the time. He came home devastated, told me what happened. My husband told me what happened. I lost my mind. I said, that doctor does not know your genetic history, Hayden. That doctor does not know my growth pattern. He only had your dad there and asked your dad. I have a totally different growth pattern, or had. You're following your mother. It didn't help. He even lost a lot of soccer playing time when he was in high school, not just his club team, because again, all those other kids had gone through the change. It wasn't until later his junior year into senior year, just like his mom, that he started growing like a weed. And then he was playing a lot more because he was starting to get bigger and could outmatch others again. But his body grew so fast, so late, that as his muscles tried to develop, as his skeleton grew, his muscles pulled off a piece of his bone. You remember your anterior superior iliac spines and anterior inferior iliac spine of your pubic bones. Well, Hayden's quadriceps muscle pulled off his anterior superior iliac spine. So he had a bone break called an avulsion, and he had to go to physical therapy because he can't exactly put a cast on that. So his senior year of high school, the first part was rehabilitating one of his, like the right side of his hip, got to the point where he could finally return to the soccer field and practice just in time for the season, then did it on the other one. Spent his entire senior year on the bench. It was awful. So he finally started growing, and it caused him to be benched anyway. It's just what an awful, awkward transitional time for so many children. And what I can tell you is when they pack on and they get chunkier, that's not the time to tell them you need to go do something and exercise more and lose weight. Because Hayden in that junior year started to get chunky and he was sleeping a lot. Well, adolescents sleep as much as toddlers do because why? That's when your brain wants to release growth hormone. So is the irony lost on you? They sleep a lot more and they're packing on weight. And a lot of parents equate that as you're sleeping and you're lazy and that's why you're gaining weight. You're getting obese. Go do something. It makes me lose my mind. My husband did that to Hayden. I said, you need to shut up. He's fine. Let me tell you what growth hormone does. They pack it on before they stretch. Please be quiet. He doesn't need you on top of all the things that are happening to him, soccer related. So those are my stories of teenage angst and growth. And I'm sure you all have your story and maybe you can relate to that. So girls, they weren't part of the early crowd and they got the unwanted attention. Or you're like me, if you're on the other side of the extreme, you wanted the attention, but you were the geeky, boobless, nerdy athlete that boys are like, ugh. And then if you were the boy that grew early and had a lot of muscle mass, girls swooned after you, right? Or you were the big man on your athletic team versus the other extreme, you didn't grow as quickly. You were a late bloomer. Hayden's still growing. He's still growing. He's a senior in college and he's still growing. He's now over 6 foot tall. He was just started late and grew fast at first, but then he's still slow and steady now. It's the weirdest thing. And his brother is starting to be the same way. So I do tend to go on and on about growth hormone because a lot of times doctors don't quite explain growth to children correctly. There is a timing and a tempo. And there is a formula they can do for projecting how tall a kid will get. So many inches from dad, so many inches from mom, and there's this mathematical formula. I'm here to tell you it doesn't always come out that way. There's a lot of genetics, and one mathematical formula does not tell you how tall your kid is going to be every single time. It is not 100% accurate. So there's that. Now, growth, like I said, does have this HPL pathway. A lot of textbooks don't talk about it. So the hypothalamus, if growth is okay, the hypothalamus will release growth hormone, releasing hormone. So that's the plus, meaning, okay, pituitary release growth hormone. The somatotrope will release growth hormone. Where will that go? Adipocytes, skeletal muscle, bone, cartilage, all of those target cells, but there's also a target gland, the liver. Now, we don't usually, in textbooks, we usually don't read about the liver being a gland, an endocrine gland. We read about it being an organ that detoxifies our blood, that has over 500 functions. Yeah, one of those 500 functions is that the liver actually does behave like an endocrine gland. It releases its own chemical signal called ILGF1. ILGF1 stands for insulin-like growth factor 1. And turns out without insulin-like growth factor 1, you won't grow. There are people that have adequate amounts of growth hormone, but they don't make enough insulin-like growth hormone 1, also known as somatomedin C. And the best example of that is a population of people called the African pygmies. So the African pygmies have plenty of growth hormone, and yet they're short. They have short stature. Clearly, growth hormone is not the end game. There needs to be something else. And that something else is somatomedin C, also known as insulin-like growth factor. Think of that as being permissive for growth hormone to actually target the bone and cartilage and lead to bone lengthening and skeletal muscle building up mass. So you need both, otherwise you won't grow right. Another population that has adequate amounts of growth hormone, but they have a dysfunctional growth hormone receptor. So they have adequate growth hormone, but the receptor for it is dysfunctional. And if their receptor is dysfunctional, then how do we get all of these tissues and how does the liver respond to it if it's dysfunctional? And those people are called the Laron dwarfs. They're found in South America. The Laron dwarfs have a dysfunctional growth hormone receptor. And then that means all these tissues, these target tissues in the liver can't respond. It's as if growth hormone was never released. So why am I showing you the picture of the brains and a procedure with basically needles going in through the person's nasal cavity, breaking through the sphenoid bone? Here's the sella turcica to get to this tumor. Well, I want you to see right here. This is a tumor of someone's anterior pituitary. That is extremely large. And that actually came from one of our part-time professors. That's a picture of his pituitary. This is Professor Huska, Robert Huska. And this is before his, or I should say, after his tumor was removed. And this is when his tumor was growing, so before it was removed. He had acromegaly. So if someone has too much growth hormone before their epiphyseal plates close, they have gigantism. So this is an example of gigantism. This is a person, Robert Wadlow. He was called the Alton Giant in England. This is his father, which is, he was 6 foot something. So his father is a tall man. And you can see how much he towers over his own father. So gigantism is what happens before the epiphyseal plates close. And then acromegaly is what happens if the person develops an anterior pituitary tumor after they've stopped growing, like when they're an adult. Acromegaly means the bone still grows, but not in length, but in thickness. Notice Professor Huska's his frontal bone and his brow. He looks stern, doesn't he? It's because the bone is growing and it's making his eyebrows kind of stick out. Notice his mandible, very thick. If he had turned to the side, it'd be protruding out. His hands, the bones, his phalanges, his metacarpals grew in width. His feet, same thing. He had to get new shoes all the time, but not in length, width. He was getting W's, and then whatever is beyond a W. I don't know, because I always have to get narrows. Anyway, he knew something was wrong, and that's when most people realize something's wrong is their shoes are too tight in width, not in length. And it keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and they finally go to the doctor and they notice facial changes. So after he had his tumor removed, he looks a lot better, doesn't he? He doesn't look so gruff. And it's a miserable tumor to have. You don't feel right. And it's also a diabetogenic because, like I said, growth requires resources. So it's antagonistic to insulin, which means your blood glucose levels go up. Again, growing takes fuel. So more glucose around for the brain, for the bones, for the skeletal muscle, for them to have access to that glucose, mostly for the brain though, because when you're growing, your brain thought processes start to change. A lot of you parents out there dealing with teenagers, you know that their thought processes start to change. You're wondering if they will ever be normal again. So a lot of growth, not just in body, but in mind. Let's see. So Professor Huska had this big tumor removed. He got better, and he ended up retiring. He was a part-timer. He ended up no longer teaching at our school because his tumor came back. And he said, I'm getting older. I need to take care of myself. No more teaching for me. So there you go. That's growth hormone. Oops. And the HPL pathway. Now, I would like you to take a 10-minute break. And when you come back, we're going to go through the thyroid gland. We're going to use the thyroid gland and its controls as a prototypic HPT pathway. We're going to learn the chain of command and all of the controls. And then once you learn those controls, you can apply it to the HPL, the liver growth hormone pathway I just told you about, and the HPA that we're going to get to in just a moment. So that thyroid gland conversation starts on slide 17 and continues through slide 29. Actually, slide 28. It's going to take me an hour easily just to get through 10 slides on the thyroid gland. So go have a nice 15-minute break. I'll see you at 4:15. We'll just call it 4:15. Go get some nutrition, a nice cold drink, and I will see you then. Okay, so on to the thyroid gland. And as I said before the break, we're going to use the thyroid gland as the epitome of the HP x-axis. So this would be HPT. First, a little bit about the thyroid gland. We'll look at it macroscopically and then go down to it microscopically. The thyroid gland is actually the largest pure endocrine gland that you have in your body. Other endocrine glands that seem larger, like the pancreas, for example, are not pure endocrine. They're a mixture of endocrine and exocrine. So the thyroid gland is just endocrine. And it is found in the anterior portion of your neck, and you can actually palpate it. That's what your doctor does when you go to the doctor. He or she may palpate around your neck, and they're making sure that you don't have a goiter. A goiter is an enlarged thyroid gland. And when a thyroid gland becomes enlarged and you develop a goiter, it is because the cells you have there get bigger. That's called hyperplasia. Sorry, hypertrophy. And also the cells there become more mitotically active. That's called hyperplasia. So those are the two reasons why someone's thyroid gland can get bigger. More cells and the cells you have get bigger in mass. It is a butterfly-shaped gland, and it has an isthmus, a narrowing portion right here. And there's a right lobe and a left lobe. Histologically or microscopically speaking, we see that the thyroid gland is arranged in these circular structures called follicles. And the cells that are on the perimeter of the follicles are called follicular cells. And it's the follicular cells that are going to make thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone comes in two forms. There's T3 and T4. T3 is also properly called triiodothyronine. And the reason why it's called triiodo or T3 is because it has three iodide residues that are attached to this tyrosine. Tyrosine is an amino acid, and it has a ring, a benzyl ring, as we call it. And there are three iodides that get attached to it for T3. T4, as you might guess, is called that because it has four iodide residues attached to the tyrosine ring. And it's called tetraiodothyronine. Tetra means four. But T4 is also called thyroxine. So again, our joke continues. There are two names for everything except for when there's more. So T4 would have four iodides. Okay. Now T3 is the biologically active form. It is only about 7% of all, and again, thyroid hormone is a combination of both of these. Okay, if I say thyroid hormone, don't say to me which one, Kara. Both T3 and T4 together are thyroid hormone. 7% of thyroid hormone is in the T3 form, and about 93% is in the T4 form. And all the cells have to do is remove an iodide, and then they have the active biological form. So T3 is the biologically active. Now, in between the follicles, not shown here in the pictures overtly, so I'm going to draw them in. In between the follicles would be another set of cells called parafollicular. Para means next to. And parafollicular cells, they're involved in making calcitonin, a totally different hormone. Calcitonin is all about calcium regulation. And even then, it's not the primary hormone involved in calcium regulation. So just hold tight on calcitonin's story until I get to parathyroid hormone. So it's going to help decrease blood calcium levels. So that would mean decrease calcium concentration in the blood, and that means the calcium is going into increased bone deposition. More on that later. So the thyroid gland has two different sets of hormone producing cells. Follicular cells, which are part of the follicle, those repeating circular units, and then parafollicular cells. Let's talk about those follicles in more detail. This picture is not from your book. This picture is from the physiology book that we use at Saddleback called Guyton and Hall. And other textbooks from the same Elsevier publisher also use this picture. But here we see those repeating structures called follicles. And you can see the follicles are made up of all these individual follicular cells. They're like people sitting around a campfire. They're making a ring around the campfire. And in the center, instead of a campfire, there is this fluid-filled space. And it's filled with a lot of protein. So that fluid-filled space is called colloid. Colloid means proteinaceous soup. Proteinaceous soup. It just means a water with a lot of protein. Okay, next time you make chicken soup, say, this is delicious proteinaceous soup, right? Chicken meat is mostly protein. So proteinaceous soup, that's just what colloid means. It's a fancy name. Well, what kind of protein is in this colloid? The protein that is put in that colloid is called thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is a precursor to both T3 and T4. It is a long chain of amino acids, over 3,000 amino acids long. And it has a high number of tyrosine residues. You might say, well, Kara, about 70 out of 3,000, that doesn't sound like a lot. Actually, that is a lot of tyrosine residues in one particular protein. And as I drew for you before, tyrosine has this ring. It's shaped like a hexagon. And there are 4 positions. If 3 iodides get attached, then you have triiodothyronine, T3. If 4 get attached, you have tetraiodothyronine. Both T3 and T4 make up thyroid hormone. And as I said, 93% is T4 and about 7% is T3, the biologically active form. If I asked you to tell me the ingredients for thyroid hormone, you should say, well, I need amino acids. It's a protein, of course, so I need amino acids. Tyrosine being a critical amino acid that I need. I also need iodide. Iodide is from our diet. Many of us eat iodinized salt, for example, to ensure we get enough iodide in our diet. For animals, they also require iodide for their thyroid hormone. That's part of the reason why there are salt licks everywhere, not to mention that they maintain their electrolyte levels as well. So tyrosine, amino acids, iodide, and notice that the iodide is shown here in your bloodstream. And these follicular cells take it in its ion form, and then they push it into that colloid space. And they also push the thyroglobulin into the colloid space. And it's not until both of them, the iodide and the thyroglobulin, so up here, let's just draw an I and a TG. It's not until both of them are in the colloid space that there's an enzyme that actually attaches the iodide to that ring, that benzyl ring of the tyrosine residue. That enzyme is called an iodinase. And the process of attaching an iodide to that tyrosine is called iodination. Old school scientists used to call it organification. So organification is also known as iodination. Iodination, I don't know how to spell that. You're putting an iodide on it. If you put 3 on, T3. If you put 4 on, T4. There are also opportunities for that iodinase to only put on one iodide on the tyrosine residue. Then it would be called monoiodotyrosine or thyrine. If there are 2, it'd be diiodo. You get the idea. But only T3 and T4 can be used. T4 is not biologically active, but cells can just take off an iodide and then they have T3 and it's biologically active. So I should say T3 and T4 are the only useful forms. You can even get a mirror image of this, and then it's called RT. Don't worry about that. That means reverse, right? RT, mirror image. What I'm trying to say is if you make the mirror image, if you make monoiodothyronine or diiodothyronine, those are not useful to the body. Nothing can be done with them. T3 and T4 together are thyroid hormone. Those are the useful forms, with T3 being biologically active. So the ingredients that we need amino acids, we need tyrosine, we need iodide, and also all the enzymes that go along with this, all of the tRNAs and the synthesis of messenger RNA and the iodinase. If any of the processes break, become dysfunctional, you're not going to make T3 nor T4. You just won't make it. And we're going to see that can become a problem. If you don't make T3 and T4, it's going to be a problem with your body. And I'm going to tell you what thyroid hormone does in just a moment and why it can become a problem in your body. But first, I want to teach you about the regulations of thyroid hormone. How does it get released? Through a hormonal pathway, an HPT pathway. So we're going to start learning the rules. And let me warn you, and Terry and Macarena can back me up on this. This is week 2 in physiology. And we go after this HPT pathway and other HP pathways, HPX, pretty intensely in the first lecture unit. And that first lecture test is, it'll bring you to your knees. It's very clinically oriented, and most students are not used to that kind of questioning. So it's a totally different beast. And some of you are going straight into physiology next semester, which is not what we recommend, actually. But some of you are, and you're going to need a lot of help in that first unit. So pay attention. I go after it pretty intensely on lecture unit 4. And here we go. First of all, 3 endocrine glands, H, P for pituitary, And then the third downstream gland in this case is the thyroid gland. That's what we mean by HPT. Now, the hypothalamus is going to release thyrotropin releasing hormone. That is the hormone that means go dog go. That tells the pituitary, hey, it's okay for you to release thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. That goes to the thyroid, specifically the follicular cells. And tells them to release thyroid hormone, which we know is both T3 and T4. The thing is, how does the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the thyroid gland know how much to release and when to release? And this is where I'm going to tell you, admittedly, kind of a stupid story about my boys and me, but it's all I've got, and I think it works. So here's my stupid story. There's always a lot of them during the endocrine system. When the boys were younger, back when they liked me and they didn't grow into teenagers and young adults with opinions of their own, I would be at home during the day. I was a stay-at-home mom during the day and then super career woman at night. And my husband worked, he's a professor, he would go and teach his classes during the day. It was the perfect system. Both of us got to be home with the kids and still pursue our careers. So during the day, I would do all things wonderful with play dates and drop Hayden off at school. Mac was still too young to go to school during this time. I had just started at Saddleback. And I would, before my husband came home, I would start to make dinner so that all my husband had to do was actually serve the boys dinner, give them bath time, play with them, read stories, tell stories, put them to bed, make sure Hayden's homework was done. So Hayden, when he was in school, Mac was not. And the rule in my house is that when you come home from school, you have a quick snack, and then it's AIS, ass and seat. You're sitting down and you're doing your homework. And you don't get to go to soccer practice if there's soccer practice that night. You don't get to go outside and play until that homework is finished. I know, mean. So Hayden would go upstairs to his room. Mac and I would be downstairs, and Mac would be helping me cook dinner. Yeah, as much as a 3-year-old could help with dinner. So Mac would be helping me with dinner, and every once in a while, I would say to Mac, I would take him off of his chair, and I would say, go upstairs and check on Hayden. Go check on him. See how he's doing with his math. I was always more worried about math than any of the other topics, like his little writing and spelling. I figured Honey could do that one. I'm math and science, and my husband was always English, writing, and history. We divided the topics. So anything science related, math related, that was my job. So I would always tell Mac, go upstairs, check on H for me. And Mac would turn around and he'd go up the stairs. He was a little guy, so he'd do one step at a time. And I can hear him going up the 15 stairs very slowly. And I can hear him opening his brother's door and then closing it. And then there would be silence. And every parent out there knows that when there's silence, no good is happening. There is only trouble. And I would start saying, Mac, get down here, come back down, let Hayden do his homework. So then I would hear the door open and Mac would come downstairs one step at a time. And he'd come back in the kitchen. I'd put him back up on his chair and I'd say, now, how is H doing? Mommy, He's not done with math yet. He says he has 10 more problems, whatever it was. And this would keep going. I'd keep sending Mac upstairs to check on Hayden. Now, the question I have to you all is, when am I going to stop having Mac check on Hayden? And you might be, go ahead.
I was going to say, when you get okay that he's done with his homework.
When he's done with his homework, of course. That's when I'm going to stop sending Mac up there. When I see Hayden coming downstairs with his homework, that's the feedback I need. That's what I'm waiting for. When I get that feedback, there is no need for me to keep telling Mac the command, go upstairs, check on your brother, report back to me. There is no need to keep yelling at the kid saying, I want more homework, right? It's done. That's it. That routine stops. Until when? The next day, when he has another set of math problems. Then we do the same routine again. So what I want you to know is, when I gave Mac the command, I want you to think of me as Mama Hypothalamus. I'm the hypothalamus. I couldn't leave the kitchen because I was cooking. The cooktop was on. I gave a command, a releasing command, to McLean. You need to go now. Go upstairs and check on your brother. Because before that, he's not allowed to bother him. I said, go and check on him. Think of Mac as the pituitary, the anterior pituitary. And I want you to think of Hayden as the thyroid gland, the downstream gland. And it's that downstream gland that I ultimately want to see a product from. From Hayden, it was his math homework. So the hypothalamus, Mama hypothalamus, gives a command to the anterior pituitary. That command is thyrotropin releasing hormone. It tells the anterior pituitary, hey, release your thyroid stimulating hormone. Now's the time to go, bother your brother, see what he's doing. We need something from him. And then the TSH that comes from the anterior pituitary stimulates those follicular cells in the thyroid gland to make all things related to making more T3 and T4 and releasing it get bolstered. Think of that as the homework. That's the product I need to see. And when the T3 and T4 hormone levels go up in the blood, that's my signal. That's the homework coming back. Good. That's great. We're good. Okay, thyroid gland, we're good now. Go off and play. Have a break until tomorrow, and when we're going to start this again. Well, that's all well and good, except that the hypothalamus does not speak, does not hear. The anterior pituitary certainly doesn't have ears. These glands don't have ways to smell, taste, hear, touch how much hormone is being released. There is no way. There has to be some other way for them to quantify how much hormone is being received. You see, if I yell at Mac, he's going to go upstairs a lot more quickly and check on Hayden more intensely, right? Mom wants to know where you are, where you are in your math homework. How many problems do you have? So if there's no way to taste it, touch it, hear it, speak it, how do these glands measure how much hormone the command was given? Because the more command, the more hormone, the more the downstream hormone should be, right? If the hypothalamus releases 200 thyrotropin releasing hormone, then the anterior pituitary should release 200 thyroid stimulating hormone, just to use numbers. Well, they don't have hands, eyes, ears, tongues, but they do have receptors. So we're going to have thyrotropin releasing hormone be these yellow dots. Okay? And these yellow receptors I'm drawing on the anterior pituitary are receptors for the TRH. Now the hypothalamus also has them. That's the only way the hypothalamus knows it even gave a command. So these TRH molecules, remember, they go in the blood. That's what a hormone does. It goes in the blood. And it circulates throughout all the body. Yeah, it starts in the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, but then it goes throughout the entire body. So that means the hypothalamus, its receptors fill up with TRH. And so do the anterior pituitary. Now for the hypothalamus, when its TRH receptor receptors are full, that tells the hypothalamus, hey, you gave a command, hold still, see what happens. If I tell Mac, go upstairs and check on your brother, and I see him turning and going up the stairs, do you think it's a good use of my time and energy to keep screaming at him as he's going up the stairs to check on his brother? That's not a good use of my time nor energy. He's doing what I asked him to do. Why should I keep screaming at him? It doesn't make sense. I gave a command. I heard it. I see him acting on it. The hypothalamus does not have that luxury. It releases a command, a hormone. The only way it knows it did so is when its receptors are filled. And then that tells the hypothalamus, hey, take it easy, see what happens. It takes time for this chain of command to get to the target cell. Just wait. So then the anterior pituitary, as a response, will release TSH, and we'll represent that as the purple dots. And that goes throughout the entire body. Yes, it's released into the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, but eventually goes throughout the whole body. And of course, the thyroid gland has receptors for it. But the anterior pituitary also has receptors for TSH. That is the only way it knows that it did its job. When it releases TSH and the TSH binds to TSH receptors, that's like the anterior pituitary going, okay, I did my job. I did what the hypothalamus told me to do. So does the hypothalamus. It has TSH as well, receptors. That is the only way the hypothalamus knows that the anterior pituitary obeyed the command. When the TSH receptors on the thyroid gland bind TSH, the thyroid gland will release thyroid hormone, which we will represent as the green dots. And of course, the hypothalamus has TH receptors. So does the adenohypophysis. That is the only way that it knows that the thyroid gland obeyed its command. And so does the thyroid gland. It has receptors for its own hormone too. So there are feedback loops. The hypothalamus, if we go back to my story, when I gave Mac the command, I heard myself speak. I know I gave it. Okay, because I hear myself give the command, I know I gave it. I see Mac go upstairs. That also reinforces that I gave a command. I see it being acted on. I should not waste my time and energy screaming at Mac as he's going up the stairs. He's already acting on my command. He goes in and checks on Hayden. Okay, Mac reports back to me. Hayden's not done yet. All right, I can wait. Sounds like there's progress. I can wait a little bit. Mac, go check on Hayden again. Mac goes and checks on Hayden. Finally, Hayden comes downstairs and shows me his homework. He's done. There is no reason for me to keep telling Mac to go upstairs and check on Hayden. He's done. There's no reason. That's silly. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy. So all of those are feedback. Me seeing Mac go upstairs feeds back to me. Kara, you gave a command. Trust that the boys will act on it. Hayden comes downstairs. Okay, that's all I needed. I'm done now. I don't need to keep repeating this process. But for the glands, they don't have eyes, ears, hands. They can't taste how much hormone they release. They have receptors. And there are short feedback loops, right? The TRH feeds back to the hypothalamus. The TSH feeds back to the anterior pituitary and back to the hypothalamus. And thyroid hormone feeds back to the thyroid gland itself, the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. And it's this part, the longest feedback loop of them all, excuse me, that has the most influence on the hypothalamus. Mama hypothalamus stops barking at all these commands once the ultimate feedback comes back. That's the thyroid hormone. So it's this longest loop, this part, that's the most important part. All of these smaller ones are just temporarily satiating the system. I heard myself speak. Okay, I gave the command. Trust that Mac will work on it. See Mac going upstairs. Okay. Eventually, I should see Hayden. So all of these are feedback. Do you all understand what feedback means? Hearing no one saying no, I'm going to assume you all understand.
Yes.
Okay, so these hormones return, cycle back, fill the receptors, and basically say to the upstream gland, take it easy. It's a work in progress, but we hear you and we're doing something about it. Just give us a little time. These things take time. But the ultimate feedback mama hypothalamus wants to have is those thyroid hormone receptors populated. That's like Hayden showing me his homework. Again, I know, stupid analogy, but it's all I've got. Now, if Hayden comes downstairs and shows me his homework, do you think it's a good use of my parenting skills and resources and energy to scream at him, say, get back upstairs and do the entire month's worth of math homework? No, that is not effective use of parenting skills. It's abusive. We don't want that. So when this thyroid hormone feeds back, all the way back, ultimately to the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus should stop releasing TRH, shouldn't it? There's no reason for the hypothalamus to keep releasing TRH. We got the outcome we want. So when those thyroid hormone receptors are bound, then the amount of TRH goes down. And when the amount of TRH goes down, then the receptors on the anterior pituitary are not populated. And that tells the anterior pituitary, oh, you're not given the command anymore. Don't release TSH. And if TSH levels go down, then that tells the thyroid gland, oh, well, I'm not being given the command. Don't release TH anymore. And that means the receptors for TH are empty. And if those thyroid hormone receptors are empty on the hypothalamus, empty receptors is like, in my analogy, it's the next day. It's the next day. Time to start over again. So with empty thyroid hormone receptors, what do you think the hypothalamus should do?
Release TRH again.
Correct. And it revs the system up again. And once the TRH receptors are full on the anterior pituitary, what do you think it should do?
Release TSH.
Correct. And once those TSH receptors are full, especially on the thyroid gland, what do you think the thyroid gland should do?
Release thyroid hormone.
Correct. And then once all those receptors are filled on the hypothalamus, what is that the signal for the hypothalamus to now stop doing?
Stop releasing TRH.
Correct. This is called negative feedback inhibition. So when the feedback comes backwards, right? It's going back upstream. Negative feedback inhibition means when the thyroid hormone comes and populates those receptors, goes backwards. It's kind of like the negative thing going backwards. Inhibition. So as TRH levels go up, TSH levels go up, thyroid hormone levels go up. And when thyroid hormone levels go up, that tells the hypothalamus to lower. Its TRH, which in turn will tell the anterior pituitary to lower its TSH, which in turn will tell the thyroid to reduce TH. And the reduced TH feeds back and inhibits the decreased release. So now if we're inhibiting decreased release, now we get increased release. And you start to appreciate the cyclical process. When TH levels go up, TRH levels go down. When TH levels go down as a result of that, TRH levels kick up again. So this is what we call the negative feedback. And when TH levels go up and inhibit the release of TSH, that's what we mean by, TRH. That's what we mean by negative feedback inhibition. How many of you have heard, and that's on slide 22 and slide 23 are just slides me showing you the long feedback versus short feedback loops. Short feedback loops are just temporary. Don't keep screaming at Mac as he's going up the stairs obeying your command. Wait for it. You want to see the homework from Hayden. How many of you have heard of hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism?
Me. I have.
Yeah, a lot of people have, right? So let's talk about, what does thyroid hormone do?
Doesn't it like do something with your metabolic rate?
So first of all, yes, it does. First of all, what does thyroid hormone target? So the target is basically all cells of the body. All of them. And yes, all cells of the body will increase metabolic rate. Well, what is metabolism? Most students tell me, oh, thyroid hormone increases metabolic rate. And then I go, okay, what is metabolism? And then they go, well, metabolism is the sum of all anabolic and catabolic reactions. Anabolic reactions build, and catabolic reactions reduce. Build up versus reduce, make smaller. So that's metabolism. So all of these building up and taking down reactions happen more frequently. That's what an increased metabolic rate means. And when you talk about metabolic rate in things like biochemistry and in physiology, you're really talking about energy made minus spent. So we all know from weight loss that if you have more energy that you spend, that you exert versus make, you're going to have a negative energy outcome. And then that means you're burning more calories than what you're storing when you're building up adipose tissue, for example. All right, so we start to think thyroid hormone, oh, that's a good thing to have. If I have more thyroid hormone, I'll have an increased metabolic rate, I'll have a negative energy, and then that means I'm going to lose weight. Yeah, so what's an outcome? Weight loss is a possible outcome. Why do I say possible? Well, if someone's eating 14 meals a day, they might not lose weight if their thyroid hormone levels are going up, right? It's about intake versus output. But weight loss is a possible outcome when thyroid hormone levels go up. All right, well, that's a general description of what thyroid hormone does. What about specifically? Remember, I said last week, each target cell will respond the way that target cell should. So what do you think thyroid hormone does to the heart? Any ideas?
Good job, heart rate.
It does. Heart rate goes up and force of contraction. What about neurons? They're more excitable. Adipose tissue, more fat mobilized. Again, more and more people start going, oh, thyroid hormone is good. I will start using my fat stores. Mobilized. When you have a higher metabolic rate, guess what else you get more of? Heat. So body temperature goes up. You don't have a fever, but you're running warm. You start to have a higher body temperature. What about gut motility?
It goes up.
Food in, food out, baby. Absolutely. Okay, so all of those things happen when thyroid hormone levels go up. Can you predict what will happen if thyroid hormone levels go down? Metabolic rate goes down. What do you think will happen to body temperature?
You're always cold.
Goes down. Heart rate goes down. Neurons are less excitable. Gut motility goes down. Fat being mobilized, not so much. So when someone has hyperthyroidism, oops, let me use a different color. If someone has hyperthyroidism, all of these things happen to a higher degree. Metabolic rate goes really high. The heat production, the person is feeling hot all the time. They could be in 20 degrees weather and they are in tank tops and shorts. I know this because when I was in Texas as a graduate student, one of our lab technicians, Sherry was beautiful. She was a total Southern Belle Texan, you know, with the drawl and everything. Total Barbie. She had blonde hair, legs up to her chin, it seemed like. And just, we loved to hate her. And yet she was so smart and so kind, high work ethic. She was just awesome in that regard. So Sherry comes in one time into the lab and we're having, in Texas, they have these cold fronts that come through and they're called Northern Express or cold front or blue northerner. They have all these names. And in Texas, in San Antonio, where I was, overnight, it could drop multiple degrees. It could be balmy and humid and hot. And then the next day, ice storms, icicles on electrical wires. So we had this ice storm. Sherry comes in wearing a tank top and shorts. I said, "Little Miss Thing, what are you doing?" She said, "Kara, over the weekend, I don't know what happened. All of a sudden I got really hot. I'm so hungry. I keep eating, but I feel like nothing's in me. I keep having a lot of diarrhea, gut motility." She says, "I feel like my heart is coming out of my chest." That's the pounding heart. It's very sympathomimetic, this thyroid hormone on heart cells. She said, "I can't sleep. I feel like I can't turn off my thoughts." And she had lost a lot of weight over a weekend, for crying out loud. And instead of me going, "Oh, poor you," you know, looking more like Barbie every day, I said, "I think you need to go to the doctor." I already thought I knew what was wrong with her. And yes, hyperthyroidism can have a very quick onset. There are different ways a person can get hyperthyroidism. So she ended up being diagnosed with hyperthyroidism. She had what's called Graves' disease, and I'll tell you about that in just a moment. And she had to, and she was married at this point, she had to decide if she wanted to have her thyroid gland removed or have it chemically ablated. What does that mean? It's the equivalent of us detonating a nuclear bomb in her thyroid to basically kill it without removing it, without surgery. And the way we chemically ablate it is by having the person drink radioactive iodide, because the radioactive iodide goes to the thyroid gland and it's a low level of radiation, low level of energy emittance. It's just enough to kill the follicular cells because they are the ones that trap the iodide to use it. It won't kill the parafollicular cells. It won't kill surrounding glands and tissue. Very low grade. Yet, ironically, when she decided to do that. She decided to have the chemical ablation. Excuse me. She couldn't sleep with her husband for about a week because of this radioactivity. And the fun part was, this was fun for us because we worked in a science lab and we worked with radiation. And there's a machine, a handheld machine about the size of my tea bottle here. And it looks like it has a microphone, you know, like you would be at karaoke, Moon River, but really it's like it's a monitoring device. And if you spill radioactive material, this Geiger counter can pick up on that. So the thing is, if you spill radioactivity, you can wipe it up, but the radioactivity is still on the surface and it can still do harm. So when we worked with radioactivity, we had to use this Geiger counter all around our surfaces to see what we might have accidentally touched, like a pen, before we take it out to another room. So we had to monitor and then clean it up properly with a solution that would absorb the radioactivity. So why was this fun that Sherry decided to drink radioactive iodide? It was fun because she couldn't come into the lab where we had this Geiger counter without it detecting it. So it'd start going, which means it's detecting this radioactivity. So it was pretty fun. She couldn't go into that room without making it squeak, and it's very annoying. It's like a fire alarm going off. And eventually, as the weeks went by, she was able to come in the room and it wouldn't make as much noise. And then she could pick up the little microphone part and put it to her throat, and we'd hear crackle, crackle. And we knew that the radioactive iodide was starting to lose its energy. It was wearing off. So it's, like I said, like a nuclear bomb, but a low-grade nuclear bomb that wears off. And at the end of the process, just your follicular cells basically are killed off. Well, now what happened to Sherry? Now she went from hyperthyroidism to what? Hypo. So with hypothyroidism, what do you think happens? Metabolic rate goes down, as you all said. Heat production goes down. She was cold all the time. She didn't have weight loss. She had gain. So she went from this skinny little thing to a lot chunkier. Not going to lie, probably some other females that worked in our building were happy to see that happen to her. Her heart rate and force of contraction went down. Her neurons weren't as excitable anymore. She had excessive somnolence, meaning she was sleepy all the time and sleeping a lot. She didn't have diarrhea anymore. She had constipation. Her gut motility went down, and her mobilization of fat stores did not happen, went down. So again, she gained weight. And they had to wait a while to make sure that her hyperthyroidism went completely away and she swung into hypo before they can give her thyroid hormone pills. So she had to take a pill for the rest of her life. That's an exogenous pill, meaning it came from outside of her. And that medication is called Synthroid. It's basically a T3, T4 supplement. It's hormone replacement therapy, HRT at its best. So now that you know what thyroid hormone does and what it looks like if someone has too much or too little, let's now practice the rules of thyroid hormone regulation, okay? A person can have hyper or hypothyroidism for many different reasons. And you all future healthcare providers, it is very likely that you will be helping someone who has a thyroid disorder. It's very likely one of you out there have a thyroid disorder, Hashimoto's, or Graves' disease, or some other version of hypo or hyperthyroidism. There are many ways a person can get there. A doctor and the nurse that helps the doctor must figure this out together. They have to figure it out together because where they have to figure out the problem that dictates how they help the person. Of course it does. The problem dictates the solution, of course. So let's play. We have a patient where we have a patient that has a thyroid function that is impaired, okay? Thyroid isn't behaving the way it should. On this side, we have too much. The thyroid is overactive or too little activity. So impaired, you can have an over-secreting tumor or an under-secreting tumor. And anytime the thyroid gland has this problem, it's not going to obey the negative feedback inhibition. It's impaired. So let's start with the too much side. Let's do too much in yellow, and we'll do too little in purple. Let's start with the too much. And I told you where the problem is first, the thyroid. So on the left side of your paper, I want you to use arrows up or down to tell me if the hormone, TRH, or TSH, or TH levels would be too high compared to normal or too low. So I'll do the first one for you. I'm doing the too much, and I'm told in this problem that the thyroid gland is the problem. So if that's the problem, then this is where I start. And I'm told that it's over secreting. I'm doing the too much side. So I'm going to put an up arrow to say that thyroid hormone levels are more elevated compared to normal. This person has too much thyroid hormone. Now feedback. Feedback, the long loop, as you know, feedback to the hypothalamus. Tell me about those thyroid hormone receptors on the hypothalamus. Will they be populated or not populated?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
What do you think they'll be? Go ahead.
I said populated, but
They're going to be populated, very well populated. There's a lot of thyroid hormone. So when the hypothalamic receptors for thyroid hormone were populated, what did I say the hypothalamus should do? Should I, when Hayden shows me his homework, should I keep screaming to get more?
no.
So what should TRH levels do? Should they go up or go down?
Down.
Yep. And then what should TSH levels do if TRH levels are going down?
Go down.
Now, in a healthy person, low TSH should make the thyroid gland stop releasing thyroid hormone. But that's not happening because the thyroid gland has a tumor, an over-secreting tumor. And so the levels for thyroid hormone stay elevated. This is called negative feedback inhibition failure. The high TH is making the TRH go down. So far, so good. It's making the TSH go down. So far, so good. But low TSH should make the thyroid gland reduce thyroid hormone level output. And that's not happening. So we're getting negative feedback inhibition failing. That thyroid gland is rogue. That's like Hayden on his own, doing months and months and months worth of homework, bringing it downstairs to me going, Mom, look, I did homework for November, December, January, and February. I would have grabbed all those sheets of homework, math homework, and said, son, you need to go outside and be normal. I didn't tell you to do this. Mac, did you tell your brother to do this? No, Mommy, I'm not supposed to go bother him until you tell me it's okay. All right, so now you do it. You do the other side. Again, the thyroid gland is the starting problem. But now on the other side, we have an under-secreting tumor. So now I'll use arrows to tell me what these 3 hormone profiles would look like. Did you say TH would go down?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And then those hypothalamic thyroid hormone receptors would not be populated. No population of those receptors would lead to an increase in TRH, which in turn would lead to an increase in TSH, which should stimulate the thyroid gland to start producing thyroid hormone, but it's not. This is still negative feedback inhibition failure. So the person on this side clearly is going to have hypothyroidism, aren't they? And the person on this side is going to have hyperthyroidism. Let's do another problem. Let's say now the anterior pituitary is the problem. This is like Mac either sneaking upstairs to bother H, saying, Mom says you need to do more homework and you better not come downstairs until all your homework for 3 weeks is done. Or Mac, when I tell him to go upstairs and he doesn't, he instead goes into the guest bedroom and starts playing Xbox instead of checking on his brother. Meanwhile, his brother is thinking, well, no one's checking on me. I don't have to do homework. I can be up here playing on something or playing with my soccer ball, juggling in my room or something. No one's checking on me. I can do what I want. So take 2 minutes to fill in the arrows you think you would see if the anterior pituitary had too much, and then do the same thing again if the anterior pituitary had too little activity. Take some time. Now's the time to guess. Now's the time to be wrong. Fill in, just like with my first example, what you think the arrows would look like for too much or too little anterior pituitary activity. That's the starting point. That's where the problem is. All right, let's go over what you put for too much anterior pituitary release of TSH. Well, that's our starting point. So if it's too much, we have an up arrow. then what will happen to levels of thyroid hormone?
Go up.
Yep. Now feedback, what will happen to the TRH levels?
Doesn't it go up too?
Well, the hypothalamus would have all of those TH receptors bound. A whole bunch of thyroid hormone would be bound to those receptors. And when those receptors are bound, then the hypothalamus should reduce how much TRH it releases. And the reduced TRH should cause the TSH levels to go down, but it's not. So this is again, negative feedback, inhibition, failure. And this person again would have hyperthyroidism. What about the other side? Too little activity. So right away, we know TSH levels would be down. What do you think is going to happen to TH levels?
It would also be down.
Correct. Now those TH receptors won't be populated. What do you think the hypothalamus should do?
Up.
What?
Yep, TRH. That's me screaming my head off downstairs. Boys, what the hell are you doing? Matt, get down here. And he's just not coming down. He's got two middle fingers up to his mom going, nope, negative. This again would be negative feedback, inhibition, failure, and it would again lead to hypothyroidism. Let's do one more. Now you're told the hypothalamus is the problem. I'm the problem. I'm going to become an abusive parent, like a mommy dearest, or I'm going to be a different kind of abusive parent where I become neglectful. So take some time. This one's easy, right? Because now we're starting at the top. If the hypothalamus has too much activity, what will happen to levels of TRH? It's going to go up. What will happen to levels of TSH?
Go up.
Go up.
And TH?
Go up too.
Yep. Now feedback.
It will lower the TRH.
It should.
Oh, it
But
should.
it should, but because the hypothalamus is impaired, it's not behaving the feedback. So this again is negative feedback, inhibition, failure. And the person again will have hyperthyroidism. What about the other side? Too little activity. TRH levels go down. TSH levels go down. TH levels go down. Feedback. What should happen? TRH levels should go up, but they don't because the hypothalamus, that's like drunk mommy. Drunk mommy, not even paying attention, not responding. Nope, nope, nope. So drunk mommy on the right side of your screen and mommy dearest on the left. No wire hangers. I want more homework. Matt, go tell your brother I need 6 months worth of math homework. It's craziness on either side. So on the right side, it still is negative feedback, inhibition, failure. And this person would have hypothyroidism. Now, let me show you something. Let's just look at slides 25, 26, and 27, what we've just completed. The thyroid was the problem on slide 25. On the left side, we had hyperthyroidism. Anterior pituitary was the problem on slide 26. On the left side, we have hyperthyroidism. Look at the arrows. Look at the arrows for slide 25 versus slide 26 versus slide 27, where the hypothalamus was the problem, and on the left side, we got hyperthyroidism. Are you noticing that the arrows for those three hormones have a very different profile? They do. Now look for hypothyroidism. Look at the right side, the purple side, when the thyroid was the problem. Look at the arrows. When the anterior pituitary was the problem, look at the arrows. When the hypothalamus was the problem, look at the arrows. All three of those slides on the right side showed hypothyroidism. And yet the hormone profile looked very different for all three examples. The hormone profile looked very different for all three hormones. The three examples I showed you for hyperthyroidism. My friends, all we have to do, if someone comes into your clinic, wherever you might be working, and you start to get a patient history from them, if they come in saying, oh, by the way, thyroid hormone also stimulates skeletal muscle and the person has shakes. They have little muscle tremors. It's not DTs. It's not like they drank too much. It's not Parkinson's disease. It's the thyroid hormone stimulating their skeletal muscle. So if you have someone coming in saying, I have raging diarrhea, I eat and eat and eat, I'm losing so much weight, I can't sleep at night, even though I'm tired, I just can't turn off my brain. My heart feels like it's pounding out of my chest. I'm shaky. I'm hot all the time. In your clinical mind, you start going, sounds like the signs and symptoms of hyperthyroidism. Then my friends, you draw blood, you send it to the lab, and guess what they tell you? They tell you the hormone levels. They tell you. And if the thyroid hormone is high, but let's say TSH is low and TRH is low, then you know it's the thyroid gland that's the culprit. You can actually, just by drawing blood and the lab telling you the hormone levels, you can figure out where the problem is. Same thing with hypothyroidism. If you get someone coming into your clinic that says, I'm cold all the time, even when it's 100 degrees out and I'm in the sun, I'm cold. I wear turtlenecks all the time. I diet, and exercise, and I'm still gaining weight. By the way, weight changes for females, number one thing that gets them to come into the doctor's office, especially if they're gaining weight when they're trying to lose, number one thing. And women are more likely to have thyroid issues than men because most thyroid issues are autoimmune disorders, and most women, autoimmune disorders typically affect women more so than men. There's lots of ideas why. We won't get into that, but they typically do affect women more than men. So again, we take the patient history, we look for the signs and symptoms, we draw blood, we send it to the lab, and we look at the hormone levels, and we can figure out where the problem is. That's what we do all day long, all day long. Here is another reason why someone can have hyperthyroidism. Besides having an over-secreting tumor, like I showed you on the previous 3 slides, this woman has an autoimmune disorder called Graves' disease. Her B cells, the ones that make antibodies, are producing an antibody, an immunoglobulin called thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin. That's what TSI stands for. So her B cells are making this TSI. It binds to receptors for TSH. So here's TSH, we'll say it's purple. Okay, and here's the TSH receptor. But her TSIs, we're going to say they are purple stars. And they can still fit in these TSH receptors. And the poor thyroid gland, it doesn't know. It doesn't know the difference. It's just, its receptors are populated. And to the thyroid gland, populated receptors mean go dog go. I need to release T3 and T4. And so your T3 and T4 levels go up, feedback, and the hypothalamus is going to have populated TH receptors. And then that means TRH levels will go down. So this pathway will be shut down. That's what I mean by the negative. It will also shut down once TRH levels go down. It will shut down TSH release. So we have reduced TRH, reduced TSH, and yet the person is mass producing thyroid hormone. And it's because these immunoglobulins, these antibodies, are stimulating the thyroid gland. And that's where we start getting the goiter. Look at this woman's goiter. You can see it right here. Let me outline it. She also has exophthalmos. Look at her eyes. Her eyes are bugging out. The TSIs, the antibodies, can also make the extrinsic eye muscles weak. They don't hold the eyeball in the socket as well, so it bulges out. That's a classic sign of Graves' disease. What are we going to have to do? Take out the thyroid gland or chemically ablate it. We've got to destroy it so it can't keep responding to the TSI. And then that person's going to have to be put on Synthroid to regulate their body metabolism. One more slide before we go on another break. These three people have hypothyroidism. And notice that two of these three people have a goiter. This woman has a goiter, and this woman has a big goiter. She has what we call endemic goiter. Why does she have her goiter? Why does this woman? She has iodide deficiency. She can't make T3 and T4 properly. Let me put it to you another way. Let's say you have eggs, butter, sugar, brown sugar, vanilla, baking soda, salt, and you want to make chocolate chip cookies, but you don't have chocolate chips. You've got all the ingredients to make a cookie. You got the egg and flour, eggs, flour, sugar, salt, baking powder, etc. You've got all the ingredients to make a cookie, but if you don't have chocolate chips, you're not making chocolate chip cookies, are you? Nope. So this woman, she's got all the amino acids, she's got all the protein machinery, but she doesn't have the iodide in her diet. So she can't make T3, T4. And if her thyroid hormone levels go down, then what's going to happen to her TRH? It will go up, and so will her TSH. Two things stimulate the thyroid gland. Two things make the thyroid gland bigger due to hypertrophy and hyperplasia. Two things only. Two things. Goiter is caused by either too much TSH or TSIs. Those are the only two ways a person gets a goiter, or a tumor, I should say, but I'm talking about stimulating, not a tumor in the thyroid gland. So things outside the thyroid gland that can stimulate it to grow, hyperplasia and hypertrophy. This woman over here has Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It is also an autoimmune disorder. But in this case, antibodies destroy the thyroid gland. They don't stimulate. So in that case, that woman, I'm going to write on the side, her TH levels are going down because her thyroid gland is being attacked. And then what will happen to TRH levels? The hypothalamus is going to start screaming, and the anterior pituitary is also going to start screaming. But the antibodies are destroying the gland. Well, Kara, why does she have an enlarged gland then if it's being attacked and destroyed? It's because it takes time for the antibodies to get through all the tissue. So some areas of the thyroid gland are just fine still so far, but as the thyroid hormone levels go down and the TRH levels go up and the TSH levels go up, the remaining healthy cells are getting bigger. And that's why she still has a goiter, even though she has hypothyroidism. Please look carefully. Two people on this slide have a goiter, and they have hypothyroidism. This woman on the previous slide also had a goiter, but she had hyperthyroidism. Here's my question to you. Do you think a doctor can use the presence of a goiter to diagnose if a person has hyper or hypothyroidism?
No.
No. The presence of a goiter means nothing. A goiter can be from hypo, a goiter can be from hyper. You have to draw blood, you have to look at the hormone profiles and figure out where the problem is. You have to find the source. You have to find the etiology, that means source of the problem. Now the baby in this picture has cretinism, and if someone calls you a cretin, that's not a nice thing to be called. They're basically saying you're dumb. And cretinism happens when a woman is pregnant. If she is hypothyroid, if she has hypothyroidism while she's pregnant, the thyroid hormone from mom enters the baby, crosses the placenta, and helps develop the baby's neurons. It leads to proper myelination. If the mom is hypothyroid, then the baby's neuronal development and myelination is then compromised, the fetus, I should say. And if the neurons do not develop correctly, if they are not myelinated correctly, then those neurons don't fire. They don't have action potentials the way they should. There's delayed thought processes. There's delayed everything. So you're being called delayed, developmentally delayed, mentally delayed. If someone calls you a cretin, it's not a nice thing to be called. This woman over here, I want you to notice how puffy her eyes are and how swollen her face seems. It's not that she's obese and has a lot of facial fat. That's not it. This is a special kind of edema called myxedema. It's edema of the non-pitting type. Meaning if you were to put your fingers on her face, you would not make indented You would not leave indentations on her face when you touched her. It's non-pitting versus other kinds of edema. When you press on the person's swollen leg, let's say, or swollen foot, your hands kind of sink into their flesh. And when you remove your fingers, you can still see the indented regions from your fingers. That's what they call the pitting edema. Hers is non-pitting. She still has this swollen face, a lot of water retention, but it's a lot, it's you know, when women go and get injectable fillers in their lips to make their lips look fuller, those fillers, when they inject them, they pull water. And so it's osmotic. So they get water to that area, which fills out their wrinkles and puffs out their lips. Think of that as edema, the non-pitting type, because there's something there in the dermis that's kind of pulling water to that area. That's what's happening with this lady with the Hashimoto. She has non-pitting edema because she has a lot of glycoproteins in her dermis, basically, that's holding and retaining like a sponge. It's like a sponge. That's what I guess is the best way to say it. Okay, that was a lot, and you need another break. So this time, take a 10-minute break. We'll call it 13. Come back at 5 minutes to 6, and I will resume the endocrine. We're going to end tonight like at 6:20, 6:25. So I'll go for another half hour when we come back from our break. We'll get through almost all of this lecture, and then on Wednesday, I will finish it. And on Wednesday, we're also going to do a lot more lab. I'm going to post a PowerPoint that I will go through in lab for Wednesday. All right, go have your break. Come back at 5:55, please. Moving on to another endocrine gland, the parathyroid gland. Para means next to the thyroid gland. The parathyroid gland are small glands that are actually embedded oftentimes within the thyroid gland. So here's I'm sure some of you have chewed gum before. When I'm at school, sometimes I chew gum after I eat because I don't have time to go to the bathroom and brush my teeth. And it's a quick way to get food that might be stuck in my teeth out, especially if I'm in office hours with students and I don't want to start flossing in front of people. So I will chew gum and it will pull the food out from between my teeth. So think of the food like maybe popcorn kernels, because I'm eating popcorn right now. Maybe the popcorn kernels that are stuck between my teeth, the gum pulls it out. And the popcorn kernel is kind of surrounded by the gum. That's a lot what happens to the parathyroid glands. Think of them as the popcorn kernel. So they're adjacent to the thyroid gland, but sometimes the thyroid gland can kind of envelop them, grow around them. The parathyroid gland makes parathyroid hormone. And there are two different kinds of cells. The chief cells are the ones that we want to focus on. They are the ones that are making parathyroid hormone. So here are the chief cells. They're called that because they are the most abundant. And the oxyphil cells, I don't ask any questions about them because I don't find them particularly exciting. It's the parathyroid hormone that is most physiologic. It has the highest physiologic importance when it comes to calcium regulation. Even higher than calcitonin. When parathyroid hormone levels are high, it will lead to increased calcium in your blood, increased calcium concentration. When parathyroid hormone levels are low, it will lead to decreased calcium levels in the blood. Which leads us to the next question. What makes parathyroid hormone be released? It's a humoral mechanism. That means something in the blood. What in the blood? Calcium levels. Low calcium levels lead to parathyroid hormone being released, which in turn will elevate calcium in the blood. High calcium levels in the blood will cause the parathyroid gland to decrease release of parathyroid hormone, which will cause blood calcium levels to also go down. There are important target cells for parathyroid hormone. They are the bone, which is a good storage site for calcium, the kidney, which basically will ensure that you don't urinate out calcium. If you're told to save it because you need it, you don't want to pee it into the toilet. And then the GI tract. We can absorb more calcium from our diet. So up here, these tiny little purple dots up here by the thyroid gland, those are the parathyroid glands. The purple dots in the picture are parathyroid hormone molecules. And the yellow dots are showing you calcium ions in your blood. So if we have a decrease in calcium ions, a decrease in blood calcium, that's our starting point up here for the picture, it will lead to an increase in parathyroid hormone secretion. Again, humoral, something in the blood. In turn, this goes throughout your circulatory system, right throughout the body. So please understand the heart here is not showing a target. It's just showing you that the heart is going to circulate the blood. So circulation. And it's going to target bone. And the bone is going to, we're going to have osteoclasts. If you remember from your chapter 6, osteoclasts are the large cells. They are multinucleated. In chapter 6, I said they kind of look like the Pac-Man ghosts. They have all of these nuclei, and they release hydrochloric acid. And it causes bone resorption. Hydrochloric acid. In the kidneys, parathyroid hormone is going to cause activation of a precursor to vitamin D so that it's now active vitamin D. So we get activation of vitamin D to calcitriol, which is the active form. And it also tells the kidneys to reabsorb more calcium. So we get more calcium reabsorption, meaning less is going to the toilet. So activation of vitamin D into calcitriol, and we reabsorb more calcium so that it doesn't go to the toilet. Now that vitamin D that we activated in the kidneys, That calcitriol goes to your GI tract. And this will lead to more absorption of calcium from your diet. Your intestines can't do that without adequate amounts of active vitamin D. And you can see on this side, let me erase, on this side, we now see that calcium levels in the blood starts to go up. And as the calcium levels in the blood goes up, we get negative feedback inhibition. And it feeds back to those parathyroid glands. And then we are going to see a decrease in parathyroid hormone release. So parathyroid hormone follows classic negative feedback inhibition. Okay. Moving on to the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are found on top of the kidneys. They are these kind of pyramid-shaped structures on top. Here they are here. In the cat, if we were face-to-face dissecting the cat, I would say to you all, you know, you're removing the adrenal glands, and you would say to me, Kara, that just looks like fat. And the adrenal glands admittedly do look a lot like fat, and they are surrounded by a lot of fat, but the adrenal glands are in there, and adrenal glands look a lot like the pancreas, but smaller. And when students start picking through the fat, they oftentimes destroy the adrenal glands. So there's really nothing for us to tag on the cats for the adrenal glands. So we have to use models. Now, the adrenal glands have two different origins for what we find inside them. There's the adrenal medulla, which is the center part, which you already learned in Unit 3. The adrenal medulla is really an extension of the sympathetic division. It is made up of modified neurons. And those modified neurons were chromaffin cells. Okay, so this was all Unit 3. The outside layer of the adrenal glands is called the adrenal cortex. And there are 3 layers to the adrenal cortex. The outermost layer is the zona glomerulosa, which releases aldosterone. Then there's the middle layer called the zona fasciculata, which releases cortisol. And then the most internal layer, closest to the adrenal medulla, is the zona reticularis, which releases a male steroid type of hormone called DHEA. So it is dehydroepiandrosterone. Say that 3 times. It's an androgen. Okay, so what does that mean? I don't have very many men in this class. I didn't start out with a lot of men anyway. It's very female dominated in this anatomy class. In my physiology class, not so much, a lot more men. But to my few men out there, DHEA does nothing for your secondary sex characteristics. Testosterone is what does that for you. So DHEA does nothing for men, not really. It's just like, I don't know, testosterone is so abundant that is the reason why they grow facial hair and have more cartilaginous growth and have deeper voices and have chest hair. But ladies, we don't have a lot of testosterone. We have some, but not a lot. And when the zona reticularis, in some women, it can become overactive. And if a woman makes more DHEA, she will start growing facial hair. And I'm sure you've heard of the circus and the circus freaks. There's a TV show that I loved watching, American Horror Story. And there was one season where it focused on the circus freaks. And there was a bearded lady played by Kathy Bates. And I'm sure you've heard of that, the bearded lady at the circus. Well, why was she bearded? She had an adrenal cortex, an over-secreting tumor, then it was over-secreting DHEA. So she started having the hair on her face that's called hirsutism. That's the hair growing on the face. And they oftentimes, you know, when they showed the bearded lady, they oftentimes show her being really obese. I actually had a female student that had an over-secreting tumor of her adrenal cortex, all 3 layers over-secreted. And she was beautiful. She didn't have a beard because obviously she took care of that and she was getting medical help for her tumor. But because of the extra DHEA, it wasn't so much hairiness as it was, she got these her muscle was more developed. You know, men, because of the testosterone, they have more muscle mass. So she was chiseled, she was ripped, and she didn't really have to work at it. Her face was just more chiseled as well. Beautiful, beautiful. And if we were on campus, I would go to my office, I would have had a picture of her. I would have said, this is a picture of Nancy. Look at her. And I mean, talk about, she had 3 boys. So I have a family picture of her. Her husband's handsome, her 3 boys, beautiful, gorgeous, blonde, blue-eyed, beautiful little boys. And she was very stunning. And I show that picture. I'm like, that is when she had her over-secreting tumor and had too much DHEA. Look at her. She doesn't look like a circus freak. So thankfully she got that taken care of. But that's where the circus bearded lady comes from. It's an adrenal cortex over-secreting tumor, specifically the layer that releases DHEA. Ladies, what else does DHEA give us at normal levels, not over-secreting? DHEA gives us our axillary hair, our armpit hair, and our pubic hair. So do you think that there is the opposite of an over-secreting tumor, over-secreting DHEA, where you don't have any? Yes, ladies, and in women that don't produce DHEA, they are hairless, meaning they don't have axillary hair and they don't have pubic hair. Can you imagine how much money you would save on bikini waxing? Wouldn't you love to have that? You'd be hairless. And then usually in physiology, when I teach this, again, all the men in the class are like, what? A hairless woman down there? They get, really? Is that for real, Kira? Yes, it's for real. Anyway, so those are the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex and the hormones they release. Now, if you are reading your anatomy book, regardless of which one you have, or you go into physiology, you should know that these layers are releasing mineral corticoids or glucocorticoids. Okay, so let me skip to slide 35. A mineral corticoid is going to regulate salt and water. And aldosterone comes from the zona glomerulosa. It's going to target the kidney, and it will tell the kidney to reabsorb more sodium. And if you reabsorb more sodium, water goes with it, and your blood volume and pressure go up. You'll learn more about aldosterone in your kidney chapter and kidney lecture. So then the zona fasciculata releases a glucocorticoid, which is cortisol. And cortisol is the only hormone, the only one of the 3 that obeys the HPA pathway. Aldosterone is released in a humoral fashion, and DHEA as well. So The only one that obeys the HPA command, chain of a command, and has all the same negative feedback that you learn for the thyroid gland, it would apply just the same as the zona fasciculata releasing cortisol. Cortisol, if you look at this picture, is your long-term stress response. Short-term is the sympathetic division. So sympathetic division is your fight or flight. Arguably, when we start having a stress response, in most animals, if they outrun the predator, the stress goes away. Stress over. You lived. Congratulations. We are one of the few animals on this planet where our society causes us stress. We don't have any predators. Our fight or flight might consist of a near miss for a traffic accident, or you have to give a presentation and stand up in front of everyone on Zoom and give your talk, or in front of a classroom when we go back. It's over, you move on. But we have long-term stress, and studies have shown that it leads to chronic healthcare problems. Taking care of yourself and having the ability to manage stress is very important long-term. The issue is one person's stress is another person's walk in the park. It's very subjective. People get overwhelmed and feel very stressed and start to have mental health issues like anxiety, depression, or other mental health issues like bipolar, schizophrenia. Those things can become worse with chronic stress. The way we handle them is also variable. You don't know someone else's stress threshold. You just don't know. And that means when stress starts tipping over into mental health issues, it's very hard for some people to be sympathetic, empathetic. A lot of times a person will just go like, get over it. Dude, get over it. This is going to go away. But it's whatever it is clearly very overwhelming to that person. And I think this is where stress and mental health issues in my pathophysiology class, for example, becomes an interesting conversation because we all perceive stresses differently. What you perceive to be stressful, causing you anxiety, losing sleep, becoming depressed and leading to eating disorders or drinking disorders. To me, I might like, okay, yeah, it sounds like you're having a rough time right now. And then in my head going, oh man, if they think they're stressed, wait till my dad used to say, walk a mile in my shoes. I guess my point is you don't know someone's threshold for stress. You just don't. Children, for example, don't have good coping skills. Children that are under chronic stress, it can lead to growth impairment. It can lead to developmental delays. They don't have the resources to deal with it. People respond more poorly to stress if they feel like they don't have any recourse or any resource at all to get them through it. They have a poorer prognosis of moving through it. Hans Selye was a physiologist. He started out as a lab technician. He was awful as a scientist, absolutely awful. His job was to take care of the rodents in the vivarium and do experiments on them. He oftentimes dropped them on the floor. He was so careless with these animals. If he had to inject them with something, oftentimes he broke the needle off inside the animal. And these rats, in particular, they were rats, these rats would hear the door open and see him come in. Rats are very smart creatures. And they would get so stressed out because they knew pain was coming. And he discovered that they had this gas, and he called it General Adaptation Syndrome. They had over-enlarged adrenal glands because they were under chronic stress. They had cardiovascular disease. They had atherosclerosis. So we have seen this same kind of physiological changes in humans that are under chronic stress. It is a healthcare concern. We are not the only animals that have a society that builds in more stress beyond a fight or flight. Studies have been done on baboons. They have a social structure where they too pick on each other. And if you're not the alpha male, your cortisol levels are going through the roof. Macaque monkeys are another example. And if you want to learn more about stress and what it does to your health, you can watch a video called Stress, the Silent Killer. And it's an old PBS show, but it's very, very interesting should you have an extra 50 minutes to watch something interesting and educational. So this middle layer of the adrenal cortex, the zona fasciculata, is what releases cortisol. And that means you're under long-term stress. For example, you're in a 16-and-a-half-week anatomy class. All of you, your cortisol levels are high. When you take a test, your epinephrine levels go high, but that's temporary. Then the test is over. Yeah, the test is over, but then you're probably thinking, now I got to prepare for the next one. There are all these hoops to jump through. And it's not just my class. You've got family obligations, social obligations. You've got other classes, possibly applications if you're trying to apply to transfer somewhere. There's a lot going on in your busy lives. We all perceive stress differently. We need to be patient and kind. And to some people, the threshold for dealing with it is set low. They don't feel they have any control over it. That's called distress. When you're in distress, it's still stress, but you're distressed. Like the rats, when Hans Selye entered the room, they had no control. There is a kind of stress that people perceive to be good, and that's called eustress. An example of stress that you might think of as good is something that you know short term gives you some anxiety, but long term you see your life being better for it. For example, having a newborn, having a baby is stressful. There's sleepless nights, there's making sure it gets fed. It's not about you anymore, it's about this little helpless infant child. But overall, most parents look at that as an opportunity for a family to grow and to experience new experiences. Starting a new job. You start out nervous. You want to make a good impression. You want to get promoted. It's the job you've been wanting and waiting for, working towards. You want to perform well. You're nervous. You're stressed over it. But overall, you know, long term, this is where you need to be. It's your moment ultimately downstream to shine. So that's what eustress is, something that gets you, oh, I want to do well. I need to do well. This is my moment. Causes you some anxiety, but down the road, you see it as a positive, not a negative. And that's what I meant by stress being a matter of perspective. Do you see the stress as distressful to you? You have no control? Or can you see it as eustress? Trying to change your perspective. Don't ruminate on things. Thinking about things is different than ruminating. Ruminating, you're a broken record. What are they going to think about me? I'm stupid. I can't do this. I'm not, I messed up. Thinking is, okay, how do I move forward? This is a temporary issue. How can I move myself out of this? And that's the part that people get lost in, ruminating versus thinking and executing a plan. Can be very challenging, can be very overwhelming to some people. So I'm going to end on that, the adrenal cortex. And when we come back on Wednesday, I will go over the HPA pathway, and I will give you some examples of disease states, like I did for the thyroid gland. You learned about Hashimoto's and iodide deficiency and Graves' disease. When we come back on Wednesday, I'll tell you about Addison's disease and Cushing's and what we would see in the person. Again, it's all cortisol. It's only cortisol that obeys the HPA pathway. Once I go over that, we'll then migrate into the pancreas. It is both exocrine and endocrine. We'll talk about diabetes mellitus. And then I'll quickly finish other endocrine glands. Gonads, I won't spend too much time on Wednesday because we'll focus more on them when you get to your reproductive chapter. And then after I finish this on Wednesday, we'll go straight into a lab PowerPoint, watching some videos together and start identifying structures on models. Do you have any questions? You're very bored.
Actually, I had a question.